So if I was talking to somebody who had never heard of the Living Standards Framework, I would describe it as the underpinning for what the Treasury does to give advice to ministers. And what I mean by underpinning is about what concepts and ideas does the Treasury put forward. And ultimately, it's about making sure Treasury captures what is important for New Zealanders, what is important regarding their environment, their community, the way we develop, and how we are as an economy. We put all of that together to make sure ministers can make the best decisions for New Zealand. When I think about Treasury staff and how they're responding to the Living Standards Framework, I always start with Treasury staff are analytical staff at the heart. They always have been and always will be. It's important to what we do. Analytical staff question. So when it's come to Living Standards Framework, they have asked many, many questions about what it is and where it can apply and how do we do it. And that has been so important to help with the integrity of what Living Standards Framework is. If we're going to give great advice to ministers, it has to be thorough and it has to be good. So what I love is that the Treasury staff are putting all of their passion and all of their intellect into making sure this is the best framework that New Zealand can have. We have got some absolutely awesome examples of how we're applying the Living Standards Framework into our work right now. You may know about the Eastern Porirua work in the housing community there. We put Living Standards Framework right into the centre of that, and it exposed a whole lot of things we hadn't seen before, many connections across many areas of government and beyond, and it made the business case, and it's gone right behind the government decisions, so we're really proud of that work. When it comes to applying the Living Standards Framework, it's so important that we give staff the support they need to be able to do something that's new and different. So there are examples like giving all of our vote analysts training on how to think about cost-benefit assessment in the budget process. We all know government's wellbeing budget is their first experiment with Living Standards Framework themselves. When I think about what the Living Standards Framework means in terms of the advice that we do and the analysis we do, and what I'd look to see in the future, I don't think there's one type of advice or one track of analysis that I would see coming out of Living Standards Framework. Like analysis and policy in general, the challenges are different, the context is different, so you get different types of analysis and answers as you go along. But what I would expect to see, and we are beginning to see, is a wider perspective on what really matters for New Zealanders right into the heart of our work. And that is what we need in order to provide really good advice so ministers can make the best decisions. One of the things I am most excited about is that the Living Standards Framework is not just a technical piece of policy analysis and advice. It is actually about the culture and who we are as a public service and as a Treasury. And deeply embedded into the Living Standards Framework is a way of being which is about diversity and inclusion. Who we are as the Treasury and who we are as New Zealanders. How we relate to the public and bring the ideas and hopes and aspirations of those into the advice that we give. This means at the heart of who we are at the Treasury is about how we act and behave to one another, with others, how we collaborate and coordinate, how we are bold and innovative, and how we are passionate and ambitious for New Zealanders. It's so essential about who we are in order to translate into the advice that we give. And it is one of the proudest things that I love as being a leadership member of the Treasury, is how we integrate all of that into the Living Standards Framework. So the Treasury is changing with the Living Standards Framework, and the change is a very organic one. I think that's an absolutely natural way of change these days, because with complex, ambiguous, difficult problems that we have in society today, which the Living Standards Framework is designed to crack, it means that you have to take a more evolving approach to change and how it happens. The other aspect of change on the Living Standards Framework for the Treasury is we are out there in the world leading the way with the Living Standards Framework. No one else is doing what we are doing and taking it as far as we have. That means we're out there and we have to trial and experiment and push and prod the boundaries a bit. And that's really exciting for us in our organisation, because it means we can keep leading the way. And world leading is what we want to be. The Living Standards Framework isn't just a whole lot of technical ideas about capitals. I like to think about the capitals in terms of how we're developing them in the Treasury itself. I'll take human capital, for example. We are helping our analysts develop some of the technical skills that you need to apply the Living Standards Framework. But you can also think about social capital, which is also an important part of the Living Standards Framework. Building a community of analysts at the Treasury. We're getting people to work collaboratively and cooperatively together to challenge and debate and also come up with solutions, to innovate and bring new ideas. These are at the heart of the Living Standards Framework. So we're integrating all of the concepts right into the work that we do. One other really important aspect that we have been developing has been around performance reporting. And you wouldn't normally think performance reporting has anything to do with the Living Standards Framework. Well, actually, what you measure matters. So as we think about what we measure in our work, how that relates to the Living Standards Framework, how we use the capitals, we're completely exploring that because we want to make sure everything we do embodies this way of thinking and of giving advice to government. Te Ao Māori is absolutely essential to the Treasury. We would describe it as the beating heart of the Treasury. I'm sitting here in our absolutely beautiful wharenui that we have, Ngā Makapuna o Tāne. It is a really special place that we come together to debate and discuss at the Treasury. It embodies the spirit of Te Ao Māori for the Treasury. We integrate it right from the start of how we're thinking about doing our work, how we carry it out in our practice. And it's something, of course, we're still learning. We're still at 101 learning about it, but we are absolutely committed to integrating it. And we've started that with Hei Ara Wai Ora. It's the framework that was developed through the tax working group. Our team members have been involved in it, and we're taking that forward now. We think that will be vital to making sure the Living Standards Framework is absolutely relevant for New Zealand. The Living Standards Framework is a representation of New Zealand and who we are as New Zealanders. And of course, at the heart of New Zealand is multiple cultures. We are extremely rich and blessed as a country for all the people that are here and the cultural richness that they bring. So the Living Standards Framework isn't about one culture or one identity. It's really about saying, how does this reflect New Zealand and what's important for New Zealanders? We've already started with the Te Ao Māori framework work, and we've been following very quickly with the Pacifica viewpoints. And we've put all of that on our website so people can contribute. And that's just the beginning. And we embed this through our engagement strategy as well. So a big part of what Treasury is doing is going out to different communities. An example is we've been working with Pacifica communities over the last 2 years, getting out there, talking to those communities about what really matters to them. And that's what the Living Standards Framework is. One of my favourite things is talking to the new grads about what they think about the Living Standards Framework, what they think about the work that we've been doing on diversity and inclusion to back up that Living Standards Framework. And the thing that I really hear from the grads is they came here to the Treasury because we're doing the Living Standards Framework. Because it just makes sense to them that this is the way that the world should be thinking and the sort of advice that Treasury should be giving. And what you get with the grads is the whole set of brand new ideas about how we can apply and use the living standards. It's that enthusiasm that our young people can bring to us that helps us have a really great framework. The Living Standards Framework is quite a challenge for longer standing members of Treasury staff. And that's because we've had a fairly different framework in the past, or at least a narrower set of things that we have looked at, and now we're looking at a wider set. The value that the longer term Treasury members have brought to us is their really deep understanding of what matters to give really solid economic and financial advice to government. It is the longer standing members of Treasury, to me, who have added enormous value in our reference groups and in our technical groups as we have developed up solid advice about how to apply the living standards. And it is our long-term Treasury folk who are really going to help make sure we integrate this with integrity into the work that we do and how we carry that forward. As a Treasury official, when you go out and you talk to different audiences about the work of the Treasury, you'll get some people who like what you do and some people who definitely don't. And you often have to spend quite a bit of time talking about why you want to do something. what surprised me about the Living Standards Framework, as soon as I started going out talking to different people about it, was there was no question about why are you doing this. It was just seen as so common sense and the right thing to do. It is New Zealanders, after all. And it became all about the how. How do we get this done? The enthusiasm, the interest. And that has been so exciting to work with. And it's such a change for the Treasury. People are going, great, you lead the way and this is exactly what we want. If I could go back in time and do it all over again, with hindsight, the thing that I would do is really look for great examples, real life policy that we could apply the Living Standards Framework to. We've spent a long time at the Treasury developing the theory and the concept of the Living Standards Framework. But ultimately, the LSF is all about people. And that means it's about making sure things really happen for people. And that will only happen if you get it out of the book and into the policy. If I could do it all over again, I would so find those examples and make it happen. I am so excited for the Treasury and the next steps for the Living Standards Framework. We had an awesome year last year. We developed the dashboard. We got the framework out there in terms of the wellbeing budget. We've got the Prime Minister talking on an international platform about what wellbeing is. And that is so exciting for us. Going forward, we've got this huge work program, developing the capability internally of the Treasury, developing our own economic narrative using the Living Standards Framework, developing more evidence and examples, and doing further work with the government on how we take wellbeing forward. We've got a really big year ahead of us, but it's such an important one, and one that we can really demonstrate and show what the Living Standards Framework can really deliver. The Living Standards Framework I see as a transformational point of time for the Treasury. I look back 30 years to I call them our ancestors. I'm sitting in the wharenui and I think about the ancestors of 30 years ago. They created us a framework and a way of thinking about the Treasury that did New Zealand some really great things in terms of state sector management and public finance management. We are now at that cusp of the next 30 years' future, and the Living Standards Framework is at the heart of it. And what I'd love to see is in 30 years' time, my future generation of Treasury looking back and saying, those people that really got the Living Standards Framework going, they transformed New Zealand and made it an even better place for New Zealanders to be. So I've been thinking about the things that really excite me about the Living Standards Framework. And for me, it's because the Living Standards Framework is all about New Zealanders. And it's about how New Zealanders want to live their lives, how we really hope they can live their lives. It has this huge aspirational element to it. It's forward-looking, it's very positive. And that's so important for the advice that we give as a Treasury. And, I think about globalisation, the challenges that we have today of climate change, of poverty in New Zealand. What we need is a framework that really helps us in an aspirational sense carry forward for New Zealand what we want to achieve. And Treasury has got that in spades through its Living Standards Framework.